This is the theBreaker.news podcast for the week of January 3rd, 2021. Happy New Year. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of the theBreaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 167. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. The Is It Just Me commentary. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And the Big Deal feature. Part 2 of the Roundtable looks ahead to some of the big stories of 2021. Will there be a federal election? Now, is it just me? Is it just me, or is it foolish to make predictions for 2021? Not going to do it this year. Because, well, before 2020 began, who could predict that a virus from China would travel around the world and infect the White House? Who could predict that the tourism industry would collapse? And who could predict that social unrest would erupt across the United States all in the same year? Did anyone predict that Joe Biden would become the next president? I know some of you predicted that Alphonso Davies would become one of the world's best soccer players, but that's minor in the grand scheme of things. As they say, truth is stranger than fiction. Just like the title of the documentary about the late, great Joe Strummer, the future is unwritten. What do you think? Email Bob at theBreaker.news. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In Apple Daily, Hong Kongers gathered on the shores of the Victoria Harbour for the New Year. No countdown events on New Year's Eve, but Hong Kongers gathered on the Avenue of Stars. Some youngsters felt it was the worst year since over 10,000 people were arrested and prosecuted for participating in the 2019 protests. 2020 was a difficult year for students, hospital workers, and the tourism industry in Hong Kong. Meanwhile, lawyer-turned-journalist Zhang Zhan was jailed for 4 years in Shanghai for, quote, picking quarrels and provoking trouble, end quote. Her crime? Reporting on the early days of the Wuhan coronavirus pandemic outbreak in China. In the Japan Times, in New Year's address, Suga vows to contain virus and hold Olympics. Prime Minister Suga, who took office in September after his predecessor, Shinzo Abe, abruptly resigned for health reasons, has been criticized for failing to contain a third wave of infections across the country. The Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics, postponed last summer for the first time in their 124-year modern history, will be, quote, safe and secure, end quote, and serve as a, quote, symbol of global solidarity, end quote, Suga said. In the Taiwan news, Chinese warplane intrudes into Taiwan's air zone on first day of 2021. While there was never any inkling that Beijing might stop the incursions just because a new calendar year started, the appearance of a Chinese military aircraft Friday morning at 11:35 dashed any hopes for a different approach. Earlier, Taiwan announced that its Air Force jets would not take part in any New Year displays, as the task of chasing away the Chinese planes was taking up too much attention. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. Coin TV Portland. Molotov cocktails thrown during New Year's Eve Portland riot. Officers responded to a large gathering where 80 to 100 people were present. Some people in the crowd began to engage in violence just before 8 p.m. on New Year's Eve. Police were hit by rocks, bricks, frozen water bottles, and paint balloons. The crowd mostly dispersed by 2 a.m. In the Seattle Times, how the Space Needle's New Year's Eve plan was dreamed up, letting us end 2020 with a virtual bang. Instead of fireworks at the Space Needle, it was a virtual light show beamed onto TVs and computer screens. A Budapest computer mapping company, Max Intensity, worked on the show. It was the second consecutive year the fireworks were cancelled. High winds were the reason on New Year's Eve 2020, perhaps a sign from Mother Nature about a tough year to follow. In the Terrace Standard, 62nd All-Native Basketball Tournament cancelled for February 2021. The Prince Rupert Tournament, which draws spectator crowds of more than 3,000 and players from across North America, was initially planned for February 7th to 13th. The tournament costs between $250,000 and $300,000 a year It is a financial generator for local businesses in the community, with restaurants, accommodation providers, and entertainment establishments all benefiting from the sports event. That's Cascadia calling in this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. Look forward into 2021 with our roundtable. Alex G. Tsakumis, former broadcaster and writer, CEO of a real estate business that straddles Canada and the USA. Aziz Rajwani of the Sauder School of Business and Langara School of Management. Kash Heed, former Solicitor General of British Columbia and former Chief of the West Vancouver Police. And MIke Klassen of the Vancouver Overcast podcast and BC Care Providers. We'll get to federal politics now. We had Shutdown Canada start the year. Justin Trudeau was touring African nations trying to buy UN Security Council votes. Then the pandemic exploded. The Liberals opened the public purse. The debt skyrocketed to about $1 trillion. The WE scandal over the summertime. The only victim of that was Finance Minister Bill Morneau, who quit over a conflict of interest. Latest broken promise as we end the year, a carbon tax increase that the Liberals said when they ran for re-election in 2019 they wouldn't be increasing. Will there be a federal election in 2021? Yes or no? And will it be Prime Minister Justin Trudeau afterwards? Will it be Prime Minister Erin O'Toole afterwards by Christmas 2021? Or maybe will it even be Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland? Where is the country going? Will there be a different Prime Minister in office this time next year? Yes or no? Start off with you, Alex.
Yes, there will be. The election will likely be sometime around March or after March, and it'll be Prime Minister Erin O'Toole. I'm just not sure yet whether it'll be a majority government or a minority government. I think Canadians are fed up with the Trudeau mythology. He's really proven himself as being qualified pretty much as a snowboard instructor and not much else. The theatrics and the nonsense have worn thin, even with people that supported him the first couple of times. Chrystia Freeland has demonstrated that she's even less qualified than Trudeau to be Prime Minister. She's a joke. And all of these things that they're trying to do, I've heard from people in Ottawa, Liberals, good friends of mine, longtime friends of mine, that they're thinking of killing the exemption on personal homes, so that when you sell your home, you have to pay capital gains on it. They do that, they'll go down to 0 seats. I think they'll get completely wiped out. And I hope they try and do that, because that's what the election will be about. These guys are absolutely crazy in the way that they spend. People talk about, the way Trump spends. The same, and we should probably do a show at some point on the failure of the media. By all means, criticize Trump for the amount that he spent. He's not a real conservative, not in my book anyway. And that's coming from somebody who's really a libertarian. I vote conservative only because I have no other political home. I don't agree with the social conservatives. I'm very much a social liberal. But I don't think that you can criticize people like Donald Trump for overspending, which he did grotesquely too, and not hammer Justin Trudeau for the exact same infraction. It'll take us forever to get out of this hole, this economic nightmare that he's committed us to. I know Erin O'Toole. I supported him, full disclosure. I admire him very much. I think he's a very principled man. My only concern is, will he be able to connect with a younger generation that is slowly starting to come to the polls? That would be my only concern. Otherwise, he is the Prime Minister next time around of at least a minority government.
Kash Heed, who will be Prime Minister of Canada this time next year?
Well, this time next year, there's a couple of factors that come into play here. And number one is the pandemic. I think the only pandemic government that has lost is Donald Trump, and he deserved to lose based on what we've seen from this individual. If the pandemic is still at the extent that we're trying to deal with it the way we are, I think it's going to be safe for Trudeau. But if we're able to have some success in dealing with the pandemic, I think people are going to look for who's going to lead us into the future so we can deal with some of the economic crisis that we're facing right now as a result of this pandemic. But I tell you, families out there right now are just trying to stay healthy. They're trying to keep their kids healthy, keep them in school, keep them occupied, trying to deal with this incredible situation that, of course, I've never experienced. I don't think the group here has ever experienced. And it's difficult for families, and that's their focus right now. I don't think they're really paying too much attention to the political aspect of it. And I think Trudeau's playing to that, where in fact, if we do, as Alex says, go to an election in March, and we're still facing the crisis we're in right now, I think he's going to be safe. I think he's going to get in. I don't think it's going to be a majority government. It'll be a minority government. But if we get out of this situation and we delay the election to further, for example, the fall next year, I think, it's a toss-up. I think Aaron O'Toole, if he starts to get away from the social conservative side of things, I think he has a good chance. And if he brings good candidates to the table, more younger people, people with bright ideas, people that are there to represent their constituents, not to be just a follower of the leader and parrot whatever the leader wants. We don't want that in politics anymore. I think you need to look at a new contemporary politician that's absolutely going to serve the constituents that they represent. So again, it all depends on the situation we're in and the time of the election.
Aziz Rajwani, who will be Prime Minister of Canada this time next year?
I'm going to go with Trudeau, but hear me out. Not because Trudeau is going to win anything. It's going to be Trudeau because there should be no election in March, right? There should be a new law enacted by either the citizens demanding it that during the time of a pandemic or an emergency like this, you cannot call an election, even if the election date falls within the pandemic. So we saw the NDP exercise self-interest as opposed to public interest during the time of an actual provincial state of emergency. You're going out to vote when a vote wasn't even needed. There should be a law that prevents that from happening, because what I'm going to say is that to me, it's a conflict of interest. During the pandemic, if you're trying to get elected during a pandemic, are you really serving the public interest? It's a conflict of interest that should be stopped, that you cannot have an election during a state of emergency like this. If you want to, since Trump has been raised, we know that Trump's a mismanager, okay? And people may disagree. That's not the debate here. But the question that social scientists and political scientists through their academic research over the next 5 to 10 years will see, to what extent was Trump's mismanagement of the health, of the public health of the country, to what extent was that mismanagement because he had an election coming up in 8 months that he knew that if the economy doesn't recover, that he had no chance of winning? And to what extent did that hasten his removal of the lockdown? And you cannot have an election compromising the lives of thousands of people. We're talking about actual lives, right? And to me, there has to be a law that puts in place, whether you put it throughout the world and all the democracies, the progressive democracies in the world, you simply cannot have an election at a time like that, because the politicians might be serving their own interests as opposed to public interest. And I'd in fact call it a conflict of interest. And under that law, you are not allowed to call an election. Now, will there be an election called? Yes, I think Trudeau will call an election. Will he win? No, but he will not win only if the Conservatives are what I always say. If they really and truly want to win, even a minority or a majority, they've got to be progressive conservatives, right? You just have to be, especially at a time like this, where citizens, businesses, small businesses need help from government. I mean, government, I don't want to say that anyone in government is enjoying a time like this, but government is calling all the shots today. Not just the political landscape or the legal landscape. They're telling business when to open, when to close, what they can do, what they cannot do. There's never been a moment in my life in Canada, the 50 odd years that I've lived in Canada, that I've ever seen government have so much power. And if we say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, absolutely, they're at a state where in the history of this country that I've lived in, that I've been in rather for over 50 years, I've never seen government have so much power. And how they exercise that power is a reflection of their leadership. And to me, calling an election during a pandemic is self-interest, not the public interest, and it should be stopped. And if you want a prediction, if Aaron O'Toole comes out as being a social conservative, he won't win. But if he comes out as being a progressive conservative, if he shows sympathy and empathy for people that are suffering in the country and creates the right political right free market landscape for entrepreneurs and small businesses to succeed. Because what this pandemic has hopefully shown any stripe of government cannot create jobs. Jobs are created by hardworking entrepreneurs, small business people, and big business people that take risks, and they need freedom to take those risks. Now, freedom doesn't mean unfettered freedom. You've got to be accountable to your employees. You've got to be accountable to the environment. Obviously, you have to be accountable to the laws of the nation. But you've now got to create a landscape, a business landscape, if you want to have recovery, true economic recovery, where entrepreneurs and small business people, men and women, are allowed to succeed. And so create the right economic landscape where success is fostered, success is encouraged, and proper incentives are given, because that's the only thing that's going to bring us back to where we were a year ago.
And finally, MIke Klassen, who will be Prime Minister of Canada in Christmas 2021?
I was just listening to Aziz saying there should be no election during a pandemic, and wondering if he's been talking to Rudy Giuliani lately. That sounds like an interesting strategy. You know what? I'm going to go probably against the group here and suggest that the Prime Minister this time next year is going to be Justin Trudeau, and it's not based on necessarily performance. It's based upon a number of factors, including the fact that the government currently has this so-called fiscal firepower that they are clearly starting to use. They, of course, began by protecting businesses by paying top-ups for salaries within different organizations. They started supplying the CERB payments. Obviously, those things are wind down. We're going to start seeing the effects of the vaccine. Certainly by the spring, we'll start to see some interesting data and reports as to how it is affecting and perhaps slowing down the impacts of the pandemic. On the other side of the equation, the Conservatives, who would be the other party that would be able to form government, have a bit of a problem. It's a similar problem that the BC Liberals are facing right now. They don't have a deep enough bench. They've probably not been able to appeal to enough people in our urban centers where there's a huge number of seats available. And so they've got a lot of work to do. I thought Aaron O'Toole's speech that he gave on the night of his winning the leadership was one of the best political speeches that I've ever heard in the last 15 to 20 years. The problem is that Aaron O'Toole has not really lived up to the expectations of that speech. He's got more work to do. I think social media, too, has made, I think, the conservative movement much more to set a course for that, because when you listen to the voices on Facebook and Twitter, as political people often do, you get a very skewed sense of what the priorities of the public are. And I have yet to see a conservative, moderate, progressive conservative, as he says, a type of leader come to the forefront. That's the kind of person that will be able to get that liberal swing vote over to the blue side, and that doesn't appear to exist right now. Aaron O'Toole could be that person, but at the end of the day, it's going to really be a case of who is able to manage the economy best after through the pandemic. And I think that the voters will probably come down on the side of the Liberals, although I don't even know if they'll be able to get the majority that they're really looking for. So we'll be watching these things very closely. By the way, I do think that if it does go much beyond 2021, then the Liberals are probably going to have to make some sort of change in their leadership, and the expectation is that it'll be somebody like Freeland or somebody else that'll come forward, much to the chagrin of Alex. So that's my sense of what's happening.
I would be very pleased if Friedland became the leader. Let me tell you, it would guarantee a win for the Conservatives.
And here we go. We're finished those rounds. Now we got a lightning round, a true lightning round. 2 minutes to kick around this question. The 1-year countdown to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics is coming. China has been a major newsmaker for all of 2020 for the coronavirus pandemic, for human rights abuses in Xinjiang, for the crackdown on democracy and free speech in Hong Kong. The question is this: you got 2 minutes to kick it around the round table. Should Canada boycott the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics? Start now.
The world should boycott the 2022 Olympics. And I've been saying that on TSN radio on my Saturday appearances for 7 or 8 months now. It's come about 2 or 3 times. I'm the only one who said that. China's disrespect for human rights, what China is doing in Hong Kong, what China is doing all over the world to others, is simply a time where you've got to stand up for human rights. You've got Justin Trudeau, a leader who always talks about human rights. In the last election, when he went into Quebec, he didn't stand up for human rights. In English Canada, always going on and on about human rights. When it comes to China, no opposition about human rights, right? And yet, we're not talking about 10,000 people, 20,000 people, over 1 million people easily are affected in China. You've got to boycott the 2022 Olympics, the world, not just Canada.
Anyone else? Anyone else disagree?
I think
You should absolutely boycott it, but will we? No. We'll show up.
Kash took the words right out of my mouth. It takes a lot of political fortitude to bow out of the games like that, and I wish it would, for all of the reasons that Aziz articulated so astutely.
I think it's possible that Canada will follow the lead of the Five Eyes, that will probably decide not to go. And I think it's for all the reasons. It's the conflicts happening in the South China Sea, the threats against Taiwan, the human rights abuses, the crackdown in Hong Kong. A number of things are going to be a strong case for Joe Biden to push against this one. And Canada, if the U.S., Australia, and other sort of G20 countries decide to boycott it, Canada will fall in line. But I agree with you. Canada has not shown a huge amount of backbone when it comes to China. They're they're dancing on a head of a pin right now because of the two Michaels and the Meng Wanzhou issue. But I think that the right decision, to be honest, and I've always found that the Olympics has always been.
We've come to the end of the 2-minute lightning round. Sorry to cut you off there, Mike.
Thanks,
great
Bob.
points all. Great discussion all. Great way to end 2020, the year that was one of the worst years of lifetimes. And let's hope that 2021 is better for everyone, happier, healthier for everyone on the podcast, listening to the podcast. Again, we thank Alex G. Tsakumis, former broadcaster and writer, CEO of a real estate business that straddles Canada and the USA, Aziz Rajwani of the Sauder School of Business and Langara School of Management, Kash Heed, former Solicitor General of British Columbia and former Chief of the West Vancouver Police, and MIke Klassen of the Vancouver Overcast podcast and BC Care Providers. Hope you all had a Merry Christmas and we'll have a very happy New Year. Thanks again for joining us on the theBreaker.news podcast.
We're all in this together, and we've got to brave the stormy weather. You can count on us, we're your neighbor, and we're all in this together.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to Vancouver punk rock legend Art Bergman, who has been named to the Order of Canada. Before he's bound for Vegas and Hawaii, Bergman is headed to Rideau Hall for the honor, on a date to be announced because of the pandemic. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca.
When you face the storm, you won't stand alone. We'll all stand together. this is our home. And it don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone. You won't stand alone.
That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of January 3rd, 2021. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on January 3rd in 1977, Apple Computer was incorporated? There are now more than 1.5 billion Apple devices in use, and the company is now worth $2 trillion. Now you know. Send me your feedback, send me your story ideas to Bob at theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. For news as it happens, follow The Breaker News on Twitter and visit theBreaker.news on Facebook. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. That's patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. Happy New Year. Until next week.